No.
Good. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Kalispera from Greece. Welcome to the second event of the academic cycle Crossroads, Folk Culture, Dance and Education. My name is Katerina Vasilaki. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Primary Education of the University of Ioannina. And on behalf of the university's Laboratory of Social Sciences and Education, I would like to welcome you all to this online lecture by Professor Anthony Shay. Professor Anthony Shay he's a professor of dance and cultural studies at Pomona College in California. He's the author of 14 monographs and edited volumes. The latest titles are Folk Dance and the Creation of National Identities, Staging the Folk, Dance and Authoritarianism, These Boots Are Made for Dancing, and the Igor Moiseyev Dance Company, Dancing Diplomats. He was a choreographer and founding director of the Amman Folk Ensemble and the Avaz International Dance Theater for 50 years. Following the lecture, there will be a short critical commentary by Dr. Filip Petkovski, who is currently professor of world arts, theory of knowledge, creativity, activity, service at the American High School, Skopje in North Macedonia. He has studied new media production, theater arts, in dance knowledge and heritage, and a PhD in culture and performance from the University of California in Los Angeles. He has also published a series of articles and a forthcoming book on dance as intangible cultural heritage. After the commentary, there will be a discussion coordinated by Professor Christos Papakostas, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Primary Education of the University of Ioannina in Greece, teaching the subject on folklore and dance. At this point, we would like to inform you that the event is being recorded, and by remaining in the meeting, you consent to that. The chat is open for you to post questions at any time. All questions will be read after the commentary and during the discussion. So with that being said, I would like to invite Professor Christos Papakostas to extend a welcome. Professor Papakostas?
Thank you all for being here. It's a great honor. Actually, Tony, you're very popular. You're kind of like a rock star. It's almost 100 people. So thank you so much. I think your bio, your dance life talks by itself. So the dance floor is yours, and it's a great honor to have you here. And Philip, thank you for the honor too. So, Tony, again, the dance floor is yours. You should unmute.
There I go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I want to first begin with why would we as dance scholars want to study the life and work and impact of a choreographer like Igor Moiseyev, who I think outside of our rather narrow field, it has been largely forgotten in the larger world. So that's one reason to look at him. Another reason to look at him is, I think for many people, Moiseyev defined what folk dance is. He certainly defined it for the Russian population. They came to believe that what they were seeing on the stage was in fact the real Russian folk dance, as they would have liked to imagined it to have been in an imaginary village somewhere in the misty past of Russia. But we also should look at Moiseyev and his work for the impact it had on the political situation in the very critical period in the 20th century of the Cold War. He actually was the very first opening performance of the cultural Cold War that preoccupied the West and the Soviet Union for so many decades. We also want to look at the meaning of his dances. They are very enmeshed, even though the company was founded with the idea of propagating all of the dances of all of the peoples of the Soviet Union. The official name in Russia was not the Moiseyev Dance Company. It was called officially the State Academic Ensemble of the Folk Dances of the Peoples of the Soviet Union. And we will see there is some irony on many levels in that title. But in fact, the productions that he created were deeply involved and enmeshed in Russian national identity. We should also look at the Moiseyev Company as the beginning of spectacle in dance, as we know it in the 20th and 21st centuries, culminating in events like river dance and the Beijing Olympic openings in 2008, which I'm sure most of us saw and wondered about. And also, we can look at even issues of gender and sexuality as presented in Moiseyev productions, or perhaps lack thereof. So my own encounter with Moiseyev, the Moiseyev Company really, was in 1958, which was the year that the Moiseyev Dance Company came to the United States amid a media circus unlike anything ever seen before. And it was the opening act of the cultural Cold War, when America was simply bowled over by the whole impact of the Moiseyev production, and I'll get into that later. So I think those are among the reasons that we as dance scholars, particularly dance scholars who are interested in traditional dance, should be interested in the life and career of Igor Moiseyev. So my own involvement was that I had grown up in the United States, absolutely unconnected with any form of dance until I began college in 1954. Dance was simply not a part of most Americans' lives. My mother and father went social dancing. That had died by the time I was young. And so social dance was something that they had on television, but other than that, dance was not a part of American lives. We had a newly formed ballet company in New York by a man named George Balanchine, and that was it. Most Americans had never encountered dance. I certainly never did. When I entered in 1954, just 4 years before Moiseyev, I began learning international recreational folk dance, and it became an increasing part of my life. And in fact, my life was at that point very heavily weighted toward becoming a professional musician. More than anything, I wanted to be the principal flutist in a major symphony orchestra. And my whole life had been dedicated to that until that time. Dance became more and increasingly important. And in Los Angeles, I became increasingly involved in the Hungarian community, the Iranian community, the Arab community, the Greek community, the Yugoslav community. All of these were whole new worlds for me I had never even imagined. And I became increasingly enmeshed in them. In 1950, and I will tell you, I tell you this because the way in which we participated in presentational folk dance as non-ethnic people, and by non-ethnic, I mean people like me who grew up in an English-speaking household and had no sense of other people's ethnicity other than seeing them occasionally in various places and festivals around the city. When I saw Moiseyev, I thought, this is something I really want to do. That folk dance could occupy an evening and keep an audience's interest was a revelation to me. Because the diaspora, and I'll give you the Greek communities performances until that time, since there are so many of you here who are studying Greek dancing, the Greek groups would come and appear on the stage. The girls in Amalia costumes made of very cheap taffeta of sky blue color and red velvet jackets. And the boys would appear in Esmenes costume, right? So we all knew that that was what Greek was. That's what the Greeks thought Greek was, or Greek Americans thought it was anyway. And they would go on the stage, and at that time, the only music available to us, unless you had access to live music, was a 78 record, and they would dance 3 minutes of Tsamiko, and then they would stand there while someone quickly changed the 78 record to 3 minutes of Sirto, and then they would do Kasapiko Servikos, because that was a fast dance. And it was one of the 3 or 4 dances that the Greek people knew, and this is what they performed, absolutely void of any choreography other than going around in a circle. So the idea that you could have an evening of folk dance was absolutely a revelation for me, and I'm sure many others. And it kind of launched my way of thinking of myself as someone who could create something like this. Okay, so let's go to the life of Igor Moiseyev. He lived to be 101, almost 102 years old. He was born in 1906. So that means he lived in the Tsarist period, he lived in the communist period, and he lived through the period of the Russian Federation. He was born in Kiev, and then, although his father was Russian, and his mother and father moved to Paris because his mother was not Russian. She was half Romanian and half French. And she had been a seamstress for the Châtelet Theater in Paris when Moiseyev's father, who was a student at the University of Heidelberg at the time, met her in Paris on a holiday. They married. And so he had a background in which, due to the political situation at the time, he was put in a pension, and he grew up speaking French until he was 9 or 10 years old. So the family moved back to Russia, intending only to go there briefly, and they got stuck by World War I and couldn't get out. So he went to his aunt, who lived in the Poltava region of Ukraine in order to learn enough Russian to go to school. When the revolution broke out, his father took him to Vera Maslava, who was a famous Russian ballerina, now in retirement. She taught him for 2 months and said that she had done everything she could for him, and took him to the Bolshoi. The Bolshoi figured largely in his background. He was trained there. He became a well-known dancer and did a few choreographies for them. The last of which was Spartacus, which in his string of very successful choreographies turned out to be an utter disaster, which we will get into later. Then he began to get involved in doing a number of activities due to the Soviet Union's creation of what they called the Dekadi. And these were 10-day events in which each republic or oblast, that is some kind of ethnic region, would have 10 days in Moscow where they would, before the Moscow public, introduce the arts and culture of their particular region. The Soviet Union at that time, and this is, I think, extremely important to understand, two things were happening. When the Bolsheviks took over the Soviet Union, first thing that they did, they were first of all shocked to find that the revolution was only successful in Russia, an overwhelmingly peasant nation, highly illiterate. They were expecting the big revolution to take place in Italy or Germany or an industrialized Western nation. The second thing that they did, so in order to promote the revolution in many other places, as they hoped they would be able to do, they backgrounded Russian identity, because for them, the Russians were part of the colonial enterprise, and therefore they were the villains and the oppressors. So out of all of the Soviet Union that used to have Academy of Sciences, only the Russians never had one of their own. The second thing that happened was that folklore per se was absolutely a non-starter for the Bolshevik revolutionary authorities. For them, it represented old ladies in backward villages doing superstitious things. So folklore was never promoted at that time. That's a very, I think, important thing to keep in mind as we look at the development of Moiseyev. So as we progress, Lenin dies, Stalin takes over. Stalin, for all of his, I would say, lunacy, was, however, a very astute man. He was not Russian, he was Georgian. And so he did not have a natural affinity to hear Russian folk music or see folk dance. However, as he began to realize in the beginnings of the 30s and saw the rise of Hitler in Germany, he had to revise his notion about Russian ethnic identity and about folklore. So he had Maxim Gorky, a very famous writer, proclaim that folklore, sometime in 1935, I think, that folklore was the purest essence of the people. He's, of course, mouthing the very thoughts of Johann Gottfried Herder, who was a 18th century philosopher who came up with the idea that the peasant was the ultimate essence of everything that was pure in national and ethnic identity. It was their language, their folklore, their folk tales, their all of that were absolutely crucial. Someone said something? So
Sorry, we cannot hear you.
sorry, am I back?
Yes, okay, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Sorry. So Russian folklore is now going to be very important, but not actual folklore. The last thing the Soviet authorities wanted to see on public stages in the field of representation was actual folklore. There was a Russian chorus that existed called the Pyatnitsky. They began to receive very important finances from the state. And we now have the founding of the Moiseyev Dance Company. And why is that? Because Stalin understood that the population of the Soviet Union would never, ever fight to protect Soviet Russia or Soviet anything, and certainly not communism. They would, however, fight for Mother Russia. And so we go back now to Moiseyev. Igor Moiseyev in this time period is very active in two activities. One is he is staging 4 performances on Red Square, athletic and gymnastic groups, of which we have Stalin wanting desperately to win the first prize for these productions. These productions were very important because it meant that you were seen in Red Square as those of us who grew up in the 50s and 60s would see the leaders all in this kind of box next to Lenin's tomb. And you would know who was who and who was in power. So it became very important, like it was in the court of Louis XIV, where you were placed on Red Square. And so these productions became very important, and Stalin wanted to earn first prize. And Moiseyev had already choreographed a number of these events where you had mass movement. And I argue that he gained a good deal of his ability to create mass movement by choreographing these staged events on Red Square using the gymnasts of the various teams. And the other way that he did was for these dekadi, these 10-day events that I mentioned earlier, when they would bring the Armenians or the Mongols or whoever they were going to bring to Moscow for these 10-day events, they had to be overseen by dancers from the Bolshoi to ensure that they had the correct and new way of presenting Armenian dance, Azerbaijani dance, Uzbek dance, whatever. And Moiseyev was very enmeshed in that activity. So there we have kind of okay. So Moiseyev then, and here we get a little murky because nothing in the Soviet Union happened that didn't come from the top. Starting a national folk dance company is a very expensive business, and governments want a payback for that business. So it's not like my experience in the United States with absolutely not a penny to my name, starting a dance company and managing to do it. In the Soviet Union, you couldn't do that. And the only approved forms of public dance were ballet and Soviet government approved images of folk dance. So here we have now the beginnings of the Moiseyev Company in 1937. Apparently, the date seems to be imprinted. February 10th was their first rehearsal, and it was 30 young tractor drivers and milkmaids who came to dance that Moiseyev had encountered in his management of the All-Union Folk Dance Festival, which had been held the year before. This is the mythology that is presented. Let me tell you that, in fact, I do not for a moment believe that he had tractor drivers, industrial factory workers, and milkmaids as members of his dance company ever, from the start to the finish. And I found a wonderful comment that he had in fact placed advertisements in one of the Russian newspapers looking for professional dancers, by which we mean ballet trained dancers. They began their rehearsals not in a stairwell, as he proclaimed, because anybody who has seen, and we will see some of these presentations that he created, there is no way that he could have at all done this kind of work in a stairwell. It's all to show humble beginnings, and I don't for a minute believe any of it. And the other thing that's very interesting is that there were other groups actually already present in Moscow. There was the Red Army Chorus and Orchestra, which had a dance unit. And there was another group called the Island of Dance. And it was called that because they rehearsed in Gorky Park, not more than 8 blocks away from the Tchaikovsky Theater, where the Moiseyev Company has been housed as long as I can remember. So he had to have been aware of these groups. And in fact, he had some major political problems in the Soviet Union, where he crossed Voroshilov, for example, who was the head of the army at that time and was very resentful of Moiseyev competing with the Red Army Chorus and dancers. So he begins the company, and apparently they announced their first performance for October of 1937 after 6 months rehearsal. And he talks about what a green, raw performance it was. In fact, he had an out-of-town performance before it, very much like in America. Broadway musicals used to open in New Haven, Connecticut, to try out before a public before they had their grand opening in New York. And it seems like Moiseyev did the same thing. He took this to the town of Gorky, and they presented their opening performance. The Island of Dance had performed 2 months before them. So I think he was under some pressure to make sure that the presentations that he did were very professional. He was also a very, very demanding artistic director by all accounts. Maya Plisitskaya, for example, writes about how she worked with him on the ballet Spartacus and how cruel and demanding he could be as a director. So they company is now in the late part of it, and Russia is about, or Soviet Union is about to be attacked by Hitler. Stalin bought 2 years off with the Ribbentrop treaty, which allowed Hitler to take over Poland and gave Stalin some breathing space. But when they attacked, it was very sudden. And I think one of the reasons that the Island of Dance disappeared as a group and the Moiseyev Company kept intact was because Moiseyev, in his biography, his autobiography, describes how he personally gathered all of the dancers together and got them out of Moscow as a unit. So for the next years during World War II, the Moiseyev Company, like the Red Army Chorus, became frontline entertainers to keep the feelings of Russian national identity alive, because face it, more than half of the population of the Soviet Union at that time were Russian. And so Stalin revitalized Russian identity and did it through these idealized portrayals of folklore, which were greatly appreciated. The Moiseyev Company spent, for example, 3 months on board a boat, or a ship, I should say, in the Pacific Ocean out of Vladivostok, and so on. So we have the Moiseyev Company becoming well known among the Russian and, in fact, Soviet population. And within his repertoire, of course, he always had 1 or 2 Ukrainian numbers, a Belarusian number, a number from the either Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, or he would have one from Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Georgia, and one from Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. So there were always these other numbers, but the large, spectacular numbers were always Russian. And it was to valorize Russian identity, which in Stalin's mind meant that they would be successful in maintaining the morale they needed to face down Hitler. So after World War II, the Moiseyev Company is now poised for its second. They talk about how the company started with 38 people and so on. I doubt that that was what was shown in public, because very shortly when they came to America in 1958, they had 110 dancers. I mean, this is a monumental company which fulfills the monumentality and spectacularized vision of the Soviet Union that the Soviet authorities so much wanted to in their field of representation. So when we look then at the Moiseyev Company, which is now basically has the field of representation to itself, the company begins to move about Eastern Europe. They begin to tour the nations like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, all of these countries now under Soviet rule, or at least under their thumb. And we think of, and the part of the mythology of the Moiseyev Company is how they went from one critical success to yet another, each more successful than the last. But in fact, when they went to Poland, what we see is that the Poles hated the Russians, to say the least, and one of his dancers actually died because the Polish people who prepared the food for them put ground glass in it, and the guy died. I mean, this is not the part that ever reaches the propaganda that's written about this company. This is really serious stuff. Moiseyev got into the habit of, when he went to Poland, for instance, he prepared for the stage a very beautiful, spectacularized oberek. And right after World War II, when everything is destroyed, people are hungry for entertainment, the Moiseyev Dance Company looked pretty good. And if they came with a dance from their own background, then the company was received more. It was a great diplomatic tool. It's why we see so many, we see a Serbian suite and a Greek suite and a Bulgarian suite, and all of these are part of the repertoire, because Moiseyev understood that as a diplomatic tool, this was a primary diplomatic move. So throughout the period of 1945, after the war, the company immediately began touring throughout the Soviet-held lands, including China, where he had a very unpleasant experience there as well. None of this reaches the propaganda state of the company's official background, but they encountered a number of difficulties in performing. In 1958, we have the Lacey Zarubin document, which is going to initiate the first cultural Cold War appearance of Moiseyev in the United States. In 1955, he had gone to Paris. They were a huge hit there. Then they went to London, a huge hit there. And I have no doubt that this is the case. The Parisians especially still remembered, for them, Russia was everything Oriental and exotic. So when the Moiseyev Company came, they were really in the footsteps of the Ballet Russe of Diaghilev and Nijinsky. So this was for them another step, and they adopted some of the costume pieces for women's couture and so on. And so it became a whole thing. So I would love to have been a fly on the wall of the State Department, who had been in negotiation for about 15 years with the Soviet Union. They had promised they were going to have a cultural exchange, but each side was terrified about what the other side was thinking of bringing. And in being so terrified of this, I can just hear the discussion. And finally, it was proposed by Saul Hurok and Stalin himself, but of course, Khrushchev by this time, that the first offering to come from the Soviet Union would be folk dance in the form of the Moiseyev Company. And I can just hear the diplomat saying, folk dance? How dangerous can folk dance be? Well, they soon found out. Moiseyev Company arrived, and they stayed for 3 months. They toured every major city. Every single house was sold out. I think half the population of America wanted to know if, in fact, these Russian people had tails and horns. And so they came to look upon this company because the idea was so exotic. But you have to remember that at that time period, America had no experience of dance, as I mentioned for myself, none. We didn't see professional dance. It simply did not exist outside of a Hollywood film. or a Broadway musical. And so here we are with this company, 100 fresh-faced young people leaping and bounding over the stage, and America was captivated, and the State Department and the industrial military complex were absolutely shocked, because they thought that their 15-year intensive anti-Soviet, anti-Russian propaganda would pay off and save young Americans like me from being indoctrinated. Of course, when I first saw the Moiseyev Company, I would have run away like a 19th century kid to the circus and joined it if there had been a way of doing it. And because they advertised themselves as folk dance, and I thought, oh, well, I know what folk dance is. It took me, of course, a while to realize, as most Americans never did, that this was not, in fact, folk dance. This was something actually quite different. So what was it that Moiseyev was doing? In fact, I'm going to argue, he created a new genre of dance, a scenic kind of dance suitable for the stage, suitable for purposes of representation. And in line with that, he created something that was not character dance from the ballet, in which he was a maestro and a brilliant performer, but rather it was a new kind of dance done in regular shoes and boots, not in ballet slippers like character dance. So he has a new kind of dance. So why don't we, Christos, if you could, show, let's look at a choreography. This is called Leto, which means summer. It was originally part of a 4-part suite, one for each season of the year. He only brought ever that I remember his winter suite, which was a female choreographer, which is a kind of walking dance, and this Leto.
Give me just a minute. Can you see the video?
Yes, I can see it. Oh, this is the partisan. That's fine. You get an idea.
Okay, let's. Sorry.
This is why I don't do technical.
Okay, no worries. No worries. Okay, Leto. Actually, we need some. It's okay. The sound is good.
Yeah, that's the opening.
I realize that you can see the video. Let me try again, sorry. Take a break, Tony. So,
I brought my tea.
συμβαίνει τώρα. Can you see the video now?
I can't see it, but maybe everybody else can.
No.
Only your screen we can see the videos, but it doesn't play.
Okay, that's strange.
Meanwhile, I would like to ask everyone that hasn't completed the participation form to please do so now. Our hope is to create a community of dance scholars, and we can communicate through your emails. So
This
I'm
is-
going to leave the form at the chat now.
Yeah, this is it.
Κατερίνα, είναι okay τώρα?
Yes, fine. We can see now.
Telephone Ustad. So I think we can see that we are looking at the Russians as they would like to be seen. We are looking at an idealized Russian village, which fits in with the whole Soviet notion of socialist realism, which means, in essence, once you can boil it down, because they never did clarify it in so many words, was that life would be like this if only life were real. But in socialist realism, this is what life should look like if it was only perfect. So the Igor Moiseyev really fulfilled that notion. If you look at his choreographies, a number of things are happening. First of all, on the gender level, we see that when the women move, they are accompanied by flutes and piccolos and high soprano instruments. When the men move, it's trombones, trumpets, and French horns. So we see even the music that accompanies the dance is gendered, but there is no overt sexuality in his productions. It simply doesn't exist. Stalin hated the idea of anything sexual. He was a very crude man, I might add, who was rumored to have had a very a potty mouth, as they say. But the idea of overt demonstrations of sexuality was absolutely a no-go with him. And this fitted in 1958 with how America saw itself as asexual. So the Cold War opened. This was the opening act. The following year, the Bolshoi came. The year after that, Moiseyev reappeared because it was so popular. And I've attended all of those performances. I met Mr. Moiseyev after a performance because the dance group, the Gandhi dancers with whom I danced at the time, held a reception, and they came to our reception, and we taught them the Virginia Reel, which apparently happened a number of times in America as the most representative folk dance that anyone could think of. So, and Mr. Moiseyev shook my hand, as he shook in that evening, probably scores and scores of hands. So while I have a very distinct memory of him, I'm sure nothing of me remained in his mind. He was an extremely genial guy. He was, and his dancers danced with us, which gave at least the illusion that there was some kind of communication, even though none of us spoke Russian and none of them spoke English. So that was what it was. But I do still have his signature in my first program. I managed to save every program I ever saw of traditional dance. I don't know what instinct made me do that, but it did. So his performances in the US, and that year was my year of graduating from UCLA, 1958. I went to Iran to be a foreign student for a couple of years. And on my way, I saw Moiseyev again in Belgium at the World Fair. And this brings up the idea that all of the nation states that either experienced Moiseyev or many of them created national companies in that image. In the Soviet bloc, everyone was expected to do so. Their administrative apparatus of their governments all followed exactly the same lines as the Moiseyev company. I have this picture here from a program. I don't know if you can see it. This is the original look that dance had when it first came to the United States. As you can see, the costumes are a good deal closer to what they would have been in a village than what we saw on the stage, where the women looked like cocktail waitresses from the Hotel Moscow. So the Moiseyev Company then made a huge impact, and the impact was not just the company itself or even the diplomatic successes it achieved, but in fact, it launched a whole number of ensembles that were designed to be in that vein. When I went to Greece in 2000 and spoke with people, and I had interviewed Ethan Karras, who's an old friend of mine, who used to run a place called The Intersection, where folk dancers went to dance in the evenings. That the Dorostratou company, Dorostratou saw Moiseyev on tour, and she wanted to do something exactly like that for Greece, but apparently English folklorist named Roderick Lang talked her out of falling into the trap of trying to reproduce this kind of thing on stage. But what we see and still can see in the world today in performance is a group like Moiseyev, the Polish state ensemble. They still have that Moiseyev look. And so it's important to understand the Ballet Folklorico of Mexico and the Nigerian and the Ghanaian and the other African national companies, the Egyptian National Company, the Retta Company, and other companies all tried to fit in this mold. There were a few people, and Filip will remember that Zvonko Livakovic, in fact, took a position that said, I am not going to do that to Croatian folk dance. It is not going to happen on my stage. So there were individuals who resisted the look, but we all fell into the magic of this company. And its impact is still felt in performances. Although I would argue that this kind of company and the spectacularized folk dance that it represented had its heyday from the 1950s to the 1990s. It has lost that patina that it had for most people. People are very sophisticated. If you look at many of these choreographies, they're extremely precious and cutesy-poo for a contemporary audience who are used to documentaries of people dancing in ways that were unavailable to people when I was starting my company. So when I went to see the Moiseyev Company in situ in there and attend their rehearsals, their current director, Yelena Sherbakova, said to me, we really need to be seen more, because she said, the producers tell us that the audiences no longer want to see folk dances. We don't do folk dance. We have never done folk dance. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Shay. That was very interesting. But I believe we have another video which was also spectacular. Maybe we can show it.
So as we look at this second video, having seen the first one, Leto, we can see an overall scheme of his work. And what is that? We have a quiet beginning, and then we launch into a group maneuver, Then we have what I call circus. He hauls out every physical, gymnastic, athletic thing he can, pushes it to the maximum, and then brings it back down, either ending in that big thing with everybody waving around, or we come back to the beginnings of the quietness. But that is his overall way, and then he fits his magic into that. So here we have the Partizani, which is a choreography he brought to the United States, and everyone oohed and awed over it, because when you see the movements, you will understand why that is.
Can you see the video?
It's again the
No.
same thing now. You cannot see it.
Okay, let me try again.
Yes, maybe you need to share the screen, not the application.
Yes. What about now?
No. Yes, now. Oh, we missed the circus part. Well, you get an idea of the choreography from looking at that clip. I always tell my students, don't try this out in your dorm room.
Κατερίνα, εσύ όταν.
I think Dr. Petkovski has a comment on how painful it was to perform these dances. Thank you so much, Professor Shay. This was an amazing introduction, and you really put us into the Moiseyev mind and all the atmosphere and the politics of the period. It was really, really interesting. As Americans, it was amazing to hear. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Dr. Petkovski, the floor is yours for a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for the presentation. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. All right. And thank you to Christos for the invitation. I have been an admirer of Professor Anthony Shay's work. I've stumbled upon his work first when I was a student at the Choreo Mundus program, which was Erasmus Mundus Master in Dance Knowledge, Practice, and Heritage. And prior to that, I was a student in Skopje. We have a high school for folk dance, and we were exposed to ethnochoreology. But as in my country, also in the Balkans, we have been following the school of structural analysis. So much of what we did was either notating, music, or, lab annotating the steps of, dances that we will find on the field, and then for the purpose of, archiving them, and then later performing them with a strict focus on the authenticity of the performance, unlike, the Moiseyev style. So, with using, original costumes and not altering the dances in any way. So when I came to Choreo Mundus, to Norway, and when I was studying under Professor Egil Baka and Andre Grau and Georgiana Gore, to mention some of the few professors, we were exposed to other literature, which was literature in English. Before that, we were only reading maybe, Serbian literature, Macedonian literature, or Bulgarian literature about dance. And he was someone who was interested in the topics that I was, and I was very, very surprised. And then I have been reading, some of his first books and articles, and I was absolutely amazed that there is someone in the United States that shares the same interests that I am. So his work has been of tremendous help to me, when writing my master's thesis. And then later, when I came to UCLA in California, of course, I immediately contacted Tony and invited him to be part of my PhD committee, along with Professor Elsie Ivancic-Dunin, who also wrote about Romani folk dances in North Macedonia and in Croatia too. I have, of course, as soon as it came out, I've read, Tony's book on the Moiseyev Company and the Dancing Diplomats. And not only this book, but many other of his works have given me perspective. That is that as dance scholars, we could be, which was something that I was not really aware of, that we could be interested in the politics, in the ideology, in the aesthetics, in the history of singular dancers, choreographers, etc., which was not something that I was exposed to. I was mainly reading ethnochoreological literature and authors who mostly wrote about dancers who did not have names, who have they interviewed in the field, and then the purpose of course was some kind of analysis of the dance, but this was not so much writing about the analysis of the dances that they were performing itself, but rather any other cultural, anthropological, societal aspects of dance, not limited to only traditional, what we call traditional dances, but stage dance as well, which was something that I was very curious about. So I'm sure his work had impacts on many other dance scholars in the region, in the United States, of course, and in the world. because he introduced these topics. Especially, I was very much interested in, and now I'm still interested in the mix of ideology and choreographic, the collective body of the people, you know, and then how these strategies and aesthetics were used particularly in socialist societies, you know, because North Macedonia was once part of Yugoslavia. And then Moiseyev's group actually had a great impact on the formation of the first state ensembles, such as Tanec in Skopje, Kolo in Belgrade, and Lado in Zagreb. And of course later with Filip Kutev ensemble in Sofia in Bulgaria. So what was initially happening, it was because of his concerts and because of his you know, public presentation in the former Yugoslavia, in the cities of the former Yugoslavia, and then the Pianitsky choir in Sofia, all of these countries, you know, have decided to follow the kind of the same aesthetics and apply, you know, their own folk dances, and then stylize them and change them to a certain degree to make them appealing and more interesting to the audience that was watching. You know, as in Russia, you know, Yugoslavia though had a bit of a different, more liberal and more open socialism, you know, and it was more exposed to the West and did not really have any connection with the Soviet Union, you know, because they were part of the non-aligned movement, even though they did not completely, you know, follow this type of aesthetics, you know, because it was heavily based on ballet movement and the ballet training of the dancers. But in the first years of the formation, let's say, of the Serbian ensemble Kolo, this was the exact same pattern. Though a lot of the dancers who were invited from villages, you know, to join and to be the first professional dancers of Serbia were trained in ballet, and then the first choreographer Olga Skoran has very much followed this aesthetics. So why is this work important in general? Because it, as Tony mentioned, Moiseyev was one of the promoters of folk dance, the concept of folk dance as we know it today. You know, before it was not a folk dance, it was just dance. It was dance that was, you know, practiced usually in rural areas, in villages. And the purpose of, you know, these stage adaptations was because of festivals and because of, you know, diplomacy and because of performing outside of their own country, and which is initially how it started. And then again, it was later on adopted by the other, you know, Iron Curtain states, but also by Yugoslavia as well. But not only that, promoting the specific concept of folk dance, you know, and then, you know, in comparison with what was traditional dance, and then the aesthetic that he made, but also because he promoted a specific aesthetic, because he had a specific vision of how, you know, these dances that were heavily practiced in rural areas could be revived, could be in a way stylized and lifted up so they can satisfy this like high art appeal to audiences, because he was quite aware that ballet, you know, was at the top of the pyramid when it comes to, you know, to dance performance, and then he strived to make his dances kind of be appealing, because he knew that the audiences were used to this kind of dance. But also he was in a way inventor, because he was the one that you know, used the kind of the political situation in the Soviet Union, as other choreographers after him did, you know, in all of the other socialist countries, where the focus one on choreographing the people, and it was the heavily influenced and then specific focus on the collective body of the people, and the dances of the people, you know, where usually no individuals get a chance to stand out, and no one is singled out, but this dancing in, you know, in a closed circle and an open circle gives a kind of sense of communality, of togetherness, and other such ideals that were heavily promoted by socialist governments. And then, you know, he created this some other scholars would say fake lore, you know, not specifically folklore, but what he wanted to prove is that it is not, you know, as it was the case, you know, in let's say in former Yugoslavia or in many other countries today, the focus did not need to be on a, you know, copy paste kind of performance of what happens in the villages and then transferring that on the stage, but rather applying a different type of training, which was ballet training, and incorporating different movement aesthetics, costuming, big orchestras, etc., to create a specific new style and new genre. So now we still have all of these folk dance ensembles that still exist, and to a degree they still perform a lot of their, let's say, iron repertoire works that are very much based on this specific style, even though, let's say, the creations did follow a different pattern, which was based on village organizations that had a high political influence, in the 30s in Croatia. But these were seen as a form of resistance, specifically to what they would call the communist regime, right? So their denial of accepting this type of aesthetics was actually kind of like a protest over the communist government and this socialist understanding of how one should choreograph the people. So I would like to thank again Professor Shay for his large contribution to the field of not only ethnochoreology and folklore, but also dance studies in general, because he is promoting topics that are of extreme relevance, especially to those of us who are interested in studying, what we call folk dance or traditional dance. Because he's giving us new perspectives, and because he's also using different type of methodologies that maybe we are not as accustomed to in using, especially in the Balkans, and because he puts this emphasis on not only looking at dance, that is not only dance analysis, but also analysis of dance and dance societies as a whole system. So I want to thank him for that, and I want to thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Petkovski. It was very interesting what you pointed out about the notion of communality and the communist idealism that also passed through dancing. I would like to make a note and a comment on the opposite side in Greece. Years later, of course, it's interesting that the same ethnicity show-off was used from apolitarchic and nationalist regimes in Greece. Also the use of gymnasts and able-bodied people, and also the return to the villagers to find the purity and the romantic aspect also is common. That it's interesting to note these communalities. Thank you so much. Professor Papakostas, would you like to make a comment?
I can talk for hours about Tony, and first of all, I'm honored for his friendship. He's always encouraged younger people, and it's a live example. I tell that before. It's a live example for students, fellow colleagues, practitioners. He's always ready. Why? Because he kept, I think, the first principle of ballet, discipline. He knows from inside, I mean, from the perspective of the movement itself, but ethnography is his way. And that's because that's why Filip is to the point. Balkan is always a different case. And Tony, I can make like a parallelism between Tony and Todorova's work. I mean, Todorova in terms of identities, but Tony brings all this theory in practice for the Balkans and to the Balkans. So what is more important for me is that he transcends and overcomes the dualism, like the structure and the context and the agency. What I mean is, Filip told that in a way. Here in Balkans, still now, even through the academia, we are over formalism. I mean, we live in the prison house of formalism. Tony, what his work does is like overcome the formalist because he knows, he understands the movement itself, the choreography itself, all the practical things, all the technical things in context. This is, we take it for granted, but it isn't. It isn't. So I'm on the same page with Filip. The most important now is people to talk and have any questions or comments. Because I have people all over.
Yes, we actually have a question from dear Andrei Nahacheski.
Another order for us.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I will read any questions you have from the chat. Dr. Nahacheski's question is, has the repertoire and success of the Moiseyev ensemble changed in the past 10 years or so, and particularly since the start of the war in the last 16 months? Dr. Shay.
That about how they register with the Soviet or with the Russian public. When I saw them in concert, the public in Moscow, at least, absolutely adores their performances, and they venerate the figure of Igor Moiseyev to the point that very little has changed in the company. I could have gotten on the stage, like Filip said, he did Leto. I used to do the quadrilles. Those dances resonate with that public. And I would imagine, even though I have no evidence because I have not been back there since the war broke out in Ukraine, so I wouldn't be able to answer that definitively, except to say that I think the idea of promoting feelings of powerful Russian patriotism still, Moiseyev's performances can still bring forth those powerful feelings and justify them.
Just to add to that, I have been, in preparation for this this talk too. Just briefly, went through. I also follow them on Facebook and on Instagram, and I think I'm to a degree up to date of what they're doing. But it does not seem that they have completely changed their repertoire. Maybe they have some new works, but I know that they are largely promoting that kind of iron repertoire, the one that was made by him, and that choreographies like Leto and the quadrilles and many others. And then what I was able to see, through looking at videos on YouTube and on their Facebook channels, is that they are still doing at least the same kind of aesthetic, the same performance aesthetic. I don't know if they have some new works today. I'm sure they do, but it would be in the same manner. It would be the same genre, I think.
Thank you very much. If I may, I just wanted to follow up a little bit. I was wondering whether their repertoire is still all of the peoples of the former Soviet Union, like can and do and should they do Kazakh dance and Azerbaijani and Ukrainian, for example?
Yes, they still do all of that. They still do it. It's like it's a museum more than a live dance company, I would argue, at this point in their existence. Although I will also argue that river dance and there's a new, and all of these companies are in fact direct grandchildren of Moiseyev's work. I will say that that legacy outlives his founding of it, because I don't think Riverdance has a notion that that's what they're building on, but in fact, he really is the founder of that kind of spectacularization. And when I was in Moscow, apparently there is an even more on steroids company that started called Kosturma or something, and I didn't get a chance to see it, but I was assured by by the concierge in my hotel that Moiseyev was the real thing.
In 2017 or 2018, I'm not sure, they had a concert at the Tchaikovsky Hall, and they have invited all of the state national ensembles from all of the other former Soviet republics, and also the former Yugoslav republics, to do one number. And what was happening is that, let's say, the Serbian ensemble will do kind of their version, you know, of what they are performing, and then right after they would do how Moiseyev has choreographed the same dances that they performed. So it was very interesting you could exactly see the comparison, you know, and how he influenced their style, but also what the real thing, you know, looks like in comparison to what he made. And I think this is on YouTube. It was a celebration of 75 years of the existence of the company. So I think you can find it on YouTube and you can see it for yourself.
Other questions?
We don't have any.
Katerina, say again, because
Of course, for the wonderful presentation. It was a big success, counting the numbers. Nobody left. We were here 2 hours, hanging on every word.
Thank you.
we have a question from Maria Kardas.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I'm Maria Kardas. I'm from Ukraine. I'm also a Heremundus alumni. And I am studying dance politics in USSR, actually. And the work of Professor Anthony Shay is my great inspiration. My question is, so now in Ukraine, there is a popular discourse of reviewing everything that is connected with the Soviet legacy and with the Soviet cultural propaganda. And there are like two polar opinions. From the one point, there is opinion that everything connected with the Soviet legacy should be cancelled. From the other point, there are like artists who are now part of that, let's say, big group in like our cultural, struggling with English here, elite, let's say. And those artists are saying that with all this discourse, we are feeling that our work is being devaluated at all. Like, we are doing great physical work. It's a great physical accomplishment, but with all the discourse, we are feeling that we are not doing any good for like our country right now. And my question is, in other post-socialist countries, does the similar discourse exist? How it has been solved? Are there any successful practices of reviewing the legacy of Moiseyev-like ensembles, of like, for example, in post-Yugoslavian countries? And is there any successful practice of reintegration those work into like modern discourses, let's say? So this is my question.
Boy, that's a question for a whole evening of getting together again. These ensembles have reached a crisis point at this point. I discovered last summer, I visited with Kolo in Serbia, and they are doing, based on the success of the Hungarian National Company, they have begun to interpolate what I would call Pina Bausch-like modern works into their repertoire in order to gain new audiences. The Hungarians began this in the 1990s, and each of these companies is now 70, 75, 80 years old, and they have different audiences. And it's the same polarity that you mentioned. The first is the founding mission of Serbian ensemble was to promote and keep alive Serbian authentic folklore on the stage. And how do they take this original founding mission and create something new for new audiences who, in some cases, I would say Lado successfully made that transition out of socialism because of the way they performed and what they performed, and their vocal aspect of their work, which they perform in the National Cathedral. So they made themselves relevant to their audiences during the Serbo-Croatian War in ways that other companies haven't. On the other hand, Moiseyev Dance, which has not changed an iota any more than what Moiseyev has done, has marketed themselves on Polish national identity. And face it, many of the current people are leftovers from the former regimes. And so they want that continuity of showing the idealized villagers. So these companies are in crisis. How do they go forward and still stay relevant to today's audiences? It's a question they're all trying to resolve. Some of it are doing more successfully than others. Like when I saw the Hungarian company, I did not feel like I was looking at Hungarian folklore at all. And that is their mission statement. So how do they resolve the problem of introducing new modern things with their mission statement of valorizing folkloric work? Yeah, that's big question.
If I may add, Professor Shay, and to answer your question to Maria, what he was very successful, Moiseyev, and then later on these state ensembles, is convincing the people through repeated performances nationwide that this was the real thing, this is the real folklore. So this opinion still prevails today, So I know in Croatia, in Serbia, and in North Macedonia, I have also made attempts to present a new, to choreograph material that was, loosely based on our folklore, and then do some different kind of aesthetic using, contemporary dance and using electronic music in order to kind of bring this topic closer to younger audience too. But in all three cases with colleagues from Serbia and from Croatia, this was met with harsh criticism, especially, by elderly people, who are these famous choreographers or, ethnomusicologists or music composers, who are convinced that what the state ensembles are performing is the real thing, and that by promoting something new, we are losing our identity, and then we are losing our ethnicity, and that no longer will be seen, as, let's say Croatian or Serbian, I don't know. So these ensembles are still continuing, performing the same repertoire for almost 7 years now. Even the new works that are created, they are based on this pattern, that they have developed in the 40s, in the late 40s. And there is no abandonment of this aesthetic. This is because usually, artistic directors that, come and then rule these companies are, very much, I don't know what word to use exactly, but they still follow what their predecessor have developed, and none of them up to date. I've been paying close attention to state ensembles in the former Yugoslavia. There's no attempts to kind of revolutionize and promote new form of performing a new aesthetic, just because of that concern that by changing something they will lose their identity, and that they will no longer be associated with the nation state. So I know, in Ukraine, this is also the case with Virsky, right, who was very much heavily based on Moiseyev. But I'm a very big supporter of Daha Braha or, other Ukrainian bands who promote this type of new, use traditional music, specifically in this case, and they're very successful internationally, whereas they don't have this like choir arrangements, and this like Russian and Soviet ballet aesthetics to promote, but rather are promoting something that they consider to be, truly Ukrainian authentic. So there are, I think, individual, but it's limited to individuals or, smaller organizations who are trying to, push their kind of new way of performing in the midst of, state agencies and state ensembles and these like political structures. So maybe it will be a matter of time, but I would think it will take a whole new other generation, for this to become kind of the mainstream ideal and aesthetic.
It's true that politics and aesthetics in dance is a very completely different question, though, at the chat. And as Professor Papakostas noted, we do have time for only one more question. So I'm going to read this question by Mrs. Nancy Harmanta. She's saying that truth is that the first time we saw Moiseyev at the 70s, we were all amazed. Do you know whether there was a kind of dance archive from which he was inspired for the choreographies? What was his source of inspiration, in short?
You're speaking of Igor Moiseyev's inspiration?
Yes, I'm reading Mrs. Harmanta's question.
I think that his inspiration was mostly in ballet. He was not a dance ethnologist. He was, or an anthropologist. He saw in his organization of these all-union folk dance festivals and the Dekadi, he, like, let's say, Tchaikovsky or another classical composer would hear a few notes of a folk song and then they would distort it wildly out of its original thing. So he may have been and he talks about being inspired by a work called Sam, which was a Mongolian piece that he rearranged for the Mongolians themselves to perform and used it as the basis of one of his works. So his works came from seeing things and then simply being inspired by them rather than attempting to put them on the stage in any authentic manner whatsoever. His works have only a tenuous contact with the real thing in the village. Unlike the Croatian state ensemble, which it imagines themselves as doing an improved version of what's happening in the field. So there's a real philosophical difference between being inspired by a folk melody and completing a 4-part Western symphony out of it, and actually hearing something close to the arranged actual song using actual harmonies. So it's a very different concept, I would say.
Thank you very much, Professor Shay, for the lecture, your comments, your answers. It was very fruitful. And of course, thank you, Dr. Petkovski, critical commentary, and Professor Papakostas, of course, for his initiative. Would you like to say a final word, Professor Papakostas?
First of all, I'm very happy. I think we achieved our main goals. And again, it's to bring people together, bring dance people together. That is the main goal. To make a bridge, a crossroad in the Balkans and worldwide. To construct a new sense of community, a community practice through dance. And trying to bring Tony's point of view in our Greek things and in Balkan things. Because the fate of this country is to be always hybrid, it's always to be in the crossroads. The historical milestone for Balkans, for the world as a whole, is the Yalta's conference. After that, the world divided in two pieces, at least two pieces. So, because of this historical decision of Greece, they embrace the Western idea. But still, as Nancy pointed out, Nancy Harmanta, we're amazed by the Moiseyev way of thinking. And to sum up, what this guy achieved is to try to overcome the bipolar of high art and low art, to bring a community cultural form to the stage, and the community cultural expression, and much more than that, became a theatrical genre. So this causes a new context, many issues. At this time in Greece, and this is it's a whole another story, we try, now we forget, and we forgot. We are very over critical to this kind of presentation, of stage presentation. It's old, it's dusty, it's rusty, it's not trendy anymore. We try to move again to the real thing, but I believe in dirty dancing, but it's another story. So, Tony, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. It's a great honor. Thank you all. Filip, we are next door. Now you are in Monastiri, in Bitola. We promise as a team, as a laboratory, from our department, from our university, to bring these people again together. Thank you all. Have a nice weekend. Dobrovecia, Kalinikta. Good afternoon, and see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much. And